Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be installing a trailer hitch and a 4-pin lighting harness on a 2012 Porsche Cayenne. Now this is the 958 Porsche Cayenne, which runs from 2011 to 2014. The 2015 to 2018 models might be the same, but I'm not going to guarantee that because I'm just some random guy on the internet and not a mechanic. But with all of that said, let's get into it. To begin with, let's go over all the materials you're going to need. First is the trailer hitch itself. That was $201.39. Next, we have the tongue and ball. That was $26.22, which is less than I normally pay for that. The 4-pin wiring harness was $32.77, and then this generic hitch cover, so the whole thing doesn't rust on me, was $8.13. That means the total for materials was $268.51, and I will link what I used in the description below, and the prices look like they've gone up a little bit. Currently, it's about $300 for everything I used. One other thing I figured out is Porsche loves to use these Torx bits. They have on absolutely everything, so plan on picking up a set of these if you don't have one already. That was $31.48 at a local store, which brought my grand total to $299.99, and no, that was not planned. Alright, first thing I did was back this thing up onto some ramps just to get it a little higher in the air so it was easier to work on. You don't really technically need to do that, it just makes your life a lot more simple. Next, I popped the trunk to give myself a nice workstation, but then because my dog is basically Dora the Explorer, she couldn't leave well enough alone, so I put her in there to keep her satisfied. Which is obviously the most critical step to this whole process. If you don't have a dog, you will be a failure. But on to the more serious stuff. We gotta start by removing this trim piece around the wheel well. That'll give us access to the bolts holding on the bumper. So there are 3 hex bolts. There's one on the bottom of that, there's one on the lower part behind the wheel, and then there's one at roughly the 2 o'clock position. And there's more than that going further forward as well, but these were the only 3 that I needed to remove to get the access I needed to the bumper screws. And if you see how all these clips are oriented after I pulled this out, you pretty much have to pull this thing straight out the side, otherwise you're gonna break it. And you don't want to break it because these stupid trim pieces are hundreds of dollars. And below that there's going to be another 3 Torx bits at roughly the 3 o'clock, the 1:30, and the 12:30 position, and those are going to keep the bumper secured. And after that, you're going to repeat this process on the other side of the car. Everything's going to be a mirror image. It's going to be really straightforward. Next is this little cover that's like on the inside of the tailgate below the rear taillights on both sides of the car. You're going to pop that out as well. And there's another 4, you guessed it, Torx bits on the bottom of the bumper that you got to pull out. And this is the point that I realized I had power tools, which helped this process go a lot faster. Back to the inside of the taillights now. This plastic cover panel pops off using a flathead screwdriver. Then you'll have another 2 fasteners behind that panel holding this taillight in, and if you get those out and you find your taillight's not coming out, keep in mind that this has been untouched for the last 10 years or so. Don't be surprised if it's a little bit stiff. Now, I was having such a problem removing the driver's side one that I actually went over to the passenger side one and worked on that one. That one came out a lot easier for whatever reason. And as you can see right here, it's got these clips that point straight in, so you have to pull this thing straight backwards away from the car. And then obviously when you're pulling these off, unplug the wiring harness as well. That way you can put these to the side so they're not dangling and smashing into your paint. Next, there are another 2 fasteners on each side that were hidden by the taillights. That's why you have to pull these out. One is at the very front corner and one is at the very back corner. And now that all of these fasteners are removed, we are ready to start working this bumper off. But before you do that, you don't want to damage your bumper, because if you do, you're going to have it scratched up and it's going to look like garbage afterwards. So I'm using an old torn up blanket that's thick enough to actually protect this from the floor in my garage. And now is the fun part that's totally not nerve-wracking in the slightest bit, and that is ripping the bumper off of the back of your Porsche. Those are some words that I never thought I would say, but here we are. Now you want to try to pull this off evenly from left to right and top to bottom. You don't want to just like rip one section all the way off and leave the other one all the way on. It's a lot easier to pull this thing off with 2 sets of hands just so you have even force across the whole thing. But if you're like me and no one fits into that category, don't worry, it is possible to do this on your own. Now the other thing is there is a wiring harness on the driver's side down low, and that is the only wire that is connected to this rear bumper. So when you get this most of the way off, you have to stop, unplug that, then you can put the bumper down the rest of the way. Otherwise, you are going to strain those wires and potentially damage them. And even though we have the blanket down to protect the surface, I'm still putting it with the painted surface up just as an added layer of protection. And then obviously make sure that there is a layer between all of those downward facing corners in the ground around still. And finally, the part we've been waiting for, this is the rear crash bar slash bumper support bar. You can see there are 4 bolts on each side. We're going to be taking that off, and that is what the trailer hitch is replacing. So I'll warn you right now, even though the one that you're pulling off from the factory isn't too heavy, the trailer hitch that you're going to be trying to hold and line up and put these bolts in, that gets a lot heavier, a lot faster than you think it will. So again, a second set of hands is very helpful when installing this, but it is not necessarily 100% required if you're a big strong boy like I am. Now before you tighten this thing down all the way though, you want to make sure that this is lined up nice and center, because let's be real, if you own a Porsche, there's a very good chance that you are a perfectionist. So if you look at the trailer hitch, there should be this like little witness hole that lines up with this tiny little like tab or nodule that sticks through it. Make sure that that is roughly centered on both sides. Even if it's not in the dead center of the thing, you just want it even on both sides of the vehicle. As long as that is lined up relatively centered, then you're good to tighten down all 4 bolts on both sides, and your trailer hitch should line up relatively perfectly. It's more important to just have it match on the left and the right side than it is to have it centered on the whole. Again, the goal is more that it'll be symmetric at the end than anything else. But once you're happy with the spacing, we're going to cut all this protective plastic off of the center of the hitch and torque down these bolts. Now the torque spec for these, for whatever reason, is damn near impossible to find. But after literally hours of hunting, the answer I came up with was 86 foot-pounds. So if you're using that and it's right, quote me. If it's completely wrong and it somehow lights your car on fire, blame someone else. So at this point, the trailer hitch is installed. So if all you're gonna do is use this for a bike rack or to hold your kayaks or whatever other stupid sport you like, by all means, feel free to reassemble it. But for the rest of us who are doing actual trailer stuff, let's go ahead and install the wiring harness while this is all apart. Now, once again, this is a 4-pin harness, and the trailer that I have that I'm going to be using has an LED light kit, which is a very low power draw. So I'm not going to guarantee that this works for all trailers no matter what, but considering the vast majority of modern trailers that are relatively small capacity are good with this setup, this should be fine for the majority of people who are doing this on their own. If you're looking to max out the towing capacity of this thing, Porsche sells their OEM kit, which is like $1,800, and that includes a transmission reflash and a 7-pin harness, as well as a brake controller module for the trailer. But it is also 10% of what I paid for this entire vehicle, which means it is way too much money to even remotely consider spending on an accessory. Alright, disclaimers out of the way. I first push this big plastic cargo mat that I have really torn feelings about out of the way, lift up the base of the cargo area, and then try to find a place to mount the wiring converter. You want to keep it as far away from your parking sensors as possible, otherwise you'll get random false readings every now and then, which is a mistake I made when I first mounted this thing. Now, I was a little bit limited by the length of the wires for where I could put this, which means before you tap into any of this and before you start cutting looms apart, you should probably mount that power converter for your trailer harness, because how far that can reach is going to dictate everything you do after this point. Now, when I was looking at mine, the wire to the left turn signal was extremely short and the wire to the right signal was very long. That's pretty typical of these kits, which means I have to mount this on the left side of the car. But in order to do that, that means I had to pull apart more of the interior, which means a lot more hex screws. Now, all of these panels were extremely thick and well built, and there was way more fasteners on this car than any other car I have ever taken apart, which is probably why, even 10 years old at this point, this thing has no creaks or rattles whatsoever. Even so, I had to jam a 2x4 in there just to give my arm enough room to work without this thing biting down on me like an alligator. It is seriously that overbuilt, and the panels are that high of quality. But after removing some of this extra foam by the spare tire, I thought I had a pretty good idea of where to mount this, and it was going to be down low on the driver's side, and then I had to run the other wire across the back over to the passenger side of the vehicle. But the next thing we'll have to do is tap into the correct wires on the factory wiring harness, and of course, because no one works on these on their own, I could not find which wire was which anywhere, which means I had to start troubleshooting it, and found out very quickly that it was almost impossible to hold the pins into the harness while pressing the brake that was 10 to 15 feet away, so I had to get a little bit creative using the longest 2x4 that I had available to press the brake, and my god, was this sketchy. So once again, if you have somebody else who can help you, that makes your life so much easier when doing something like this, but but I guess that's just karma for nobody in this world loving me. And with the wires figured out on the car, next is going to be wiring this harness into those, but Porsche, with their impeccably high build quality standards, makes this as difficult as possible because they do a really good job building these things. And here's what I mean by that. These wire looms for the taillights are extremely well wrapped and insulated. Like, I have never seen a taillight wire loom that was this well prepared. So here you see this big tree branch looking thing. The first part of that you see on the top, that goes to only the taillight. You can split this harness further down, but the farther down you go, the more wires it picks up, and the more wires you're going to have to separate to get the one that you're tapping into. So the gist of what you're going to do is peel back the loom on that wire, and again, be very careful to not cut into any of the wires themselves. Separate the bundle ever so slightly, and then tap into the wires using the corresponding wire from the trailer wiring harness with these vampire clips. Now the problem is these are bulky and these wires are very tightly wrapped and very well sheathed, so getting it in there is a heck of a struggle courtesy of Porsche's build quality. Keep in mind that your trailer wiring harness might be a little bit different than mine, okay? But that said, the brown wire from my wiring harness, which is supposed to go to the taillights, goes to the yellow and gray wire in the wiring harness on the taillight. The red wire on the trailer wiring harness, which is for the brake lights, that went to the blue and yellow wire in my wiring harness on the car. The yellow wire on the trailer harness went to the green and white wire on the car's harness. And then the white wire that looks like it's all on its own, there is a grounding stud that is located below this as part of a bracket for something else. I connected that white wire to that ground stud, put the bolt back over the top of it. I'm pointing to that stud right here. It is behind the rest of this harness, but you know what? I'm literally holding this thing open with a 2x4 and still scraping my arm by sticking it in there. These panels are quite tight and I couldn't really comfortably fit a camera in there. This is really the best that I could do. And finally, the green wire on the trailer harness, that is going to run underneath. Try to tuck that away nice and neat so it's out of the way. It's going to go over to your right turn signal, which was the black wire with the white stripe on it. This is where I had a little bit of challenge getting the wire to reach the whole way across, is they try to give you as little wire as possible. That's how they keep their costs down and make these harnesses affordable, but it really limits where you can cut into this harness, and because it's so tightly bound, it's not exactly easy to work with this harness to begin with. So if you're having trouble reaching a place that you can actually splice into, don't be afraid to grab an extra length of wire and extend this on your own if that's what you need to do. Obviously, you'll need to either solder or crimp on a connection to make that extension, but honestly, that could be the difference between you straining the crap out of this wire and having it fail prematurely versus having an install that actually lasts you the life of the vehicle. Now, for all these connections, I'm just using these little blue vampire clips that came with the kit. Basically, the wire that is on the car goes through the whole way, and then the secondary wire that you're splicing in goes into the second spot. You use some pliers to crush these things down, and then they clamp close with like a little plastic clip on the outside, and all you're doing is bridging power from the main line over to the second line to basically tap into the signal. But anyhow, at this point, you should have everything connected and the car should be ready to put back together. But I would suggest, if you have the ability to, even if it's just with one of these trailer testers that you can get for a couple bucks, do whatever you can to test out these lights before you go through the effort of putting everything together and finding out that you have a loose connection somewhere or that you spliced into the wrong wire. Because this car, with how overbuilt everything is and the ridiculous number of hex bolts there are to take everything apart and put it back, you really don't want to be doing this twice unless you absolutely need to. Now, the steps to reassemble it are obviously just the reverse of the steps to take it apart, so I'm not going to go into detail on those. But when you get to the point that you're hooking up your trailer to test the lights, Porsche does this really weird and stereotypically over-engineered thing where the lights won't turn on immediately when you start the car. And the reason is they have whatever computer system that controls the light do basically like a system sweep to make sure there's no weird power draws anywhere and to make sure every part of the system's getting the right amount of power. So basically you have to start up the car with the lights already plugged in, then give it anywhere from 15 seconds to a minute, then the lights are going to start working. The only caveat I have is that I couldn't get the taillights to turn on as like the normal running lights when the DRLs or the headlights just turned on. I don't know why that is. I think it's because Porsche deliberately says, hey, the rear lights shouldn't need this much power, so we're just not going to give it that much power. Now, I have had a friend follow me and they said that my taillights were turned on just fine and that all my turn signals and everything were working, but the fact that it takes a minute or two for these to start up every time always makes me nervous because I'm never confident if they're going to work. And let's be clear, to my knowledge, they've never not turned on, and every time I've done an intermittent check at the start or the end of the season, they've always been fine, but that 30 seconds of waiting is the longest 30 seconds of your life, and you will be sweating bullets for a minute thinking that you did something wrong. I promise you didn't. Porsche just over-engineered the absolute crap out of their lighting system. But once I was a little bit more confident with double checking all of my connections again, and once I actually figured out that it was working fine, I buttoned everything back up and everything was good to go. So the best part about this being a very over-engineered car is everything in the back of the car, like the bumper, snaps in so perfectly even if you have no bodywork skills whatsoever. Even after reassembly, if you've never done this before, all the alignment is going to come out flawless. That was a big concern of mine by tearing everything apart, was that it wasn't going to go back together well. Honestly, you could never tell that I ripped off the entire bumper in my garage using basically a screwdriver. But anyhow, guys, that's going to do it for this episode. Hopefully this saves you guys some money, because we all know that we're going to need that for maintenance on our 10-year-old Porsches. But either way, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.